19 years old, $28, and a Ziploc bag of documents. That was all Cora Vane carried out of the Coos Bay group home on a gray February morning that smelled like rain and low tide. She had aged out of Oregon's foster system on a Thursday, walked to the county wharf with a list of shelters that had no space, and stood at an auction posting board long enough to read it twice. The county had listed a sunken houseboat in Slip 14 at Aldous Marine, assessed at nothing, priced at $5 because the alternative was paying someone to haul it away. She raised her hand. 2 weeks later, when she finally cleared the bilge water and found the welded steel panel beneath the whole floor, what was sealed inside wasn't damage. It was something Roy Oldys had locked there the decade before Cora was born, for reasons she didn't understand yet, and wouldn't until she had read every word he left behind. Cora's mother was named Sandra, and she died when Cora was 11 of a thing the death certificate listed as heart failure, but that Cora had come to understand, in the years since, as a more complicated kind of exhaustion. Sandra Vane had spent most of her adult life in motion, 2 jobs at once, cheap apartments in a pattern that repeated across counties and employers, keeping a small daughter enrolled in school and fed through a sequence of addresses that Cora could recite in order from memory. 8 apartments in 7 years. She knew her mother's version of stability: a hot plate, an air mattress, a library card in whatever town they landed in. Sandra read to Cora every evening from whatever book they had, regardless of how long the shift had been or how early the next one started. She read slowly, tracing each line with one finger, pausing when something struck her as exactly right. That was the thing that didn't move with the addresses. Sandra died on a Tuesday in October. Cora came home from school to an apartment that was too quiet and found her on the couch. She sat down beside her on the floor and stayed there for a long time before she called anyone. There was no particular reason for the long time. She just was not ready yet for the thing to be official. After that came a great-aunt's house in Medford for 3 months. The great-aunt was old and not unkind, but not equipped in the particular ways a 12-year-old needed, and when the social worker came in January with the right paperwork, Cora went with her without making it difficult. She had understood already that this decision had been made before anyone thought to ask her about it. There were 5 placements in 4 years. Cora was not a difficult child, which was both accurate and misleading. She had learned that being undemanding was its own kind of protection. She did her schoolwork wherever she was enrolled. She stayed quiet at dinner tables. She folded her clothes, cleared her dishes, did not take up more space than she was given. She also learned to read a room the way her mother had taught her. Because Sandra had been very good at it, and it was a thing you could inherit: watch what people do with their hands, listen to what they leave unsaid, adjust before they have to ask you to. It was a useful skill and a sad one to have at 12. The placements had their textures. A couple in Grants Pass with a structured house and a rules list posted on the refrigerator, which Cora memorized on her first day. A single woman in Roseburg with good intentions and too many animals. A third placement she did not think about if she could help it. A fourth and fifth that were adequate in the way that adequate means: nothing wrong enough to name, nothing warm enough to remember clearly. She graduated from Coos Bay High School on a Thursday afternoon in June. Nobody from her current placement attended, which she had expected. Tom, the coordinator of the group home she'd be moving to, drove over and sat in the back and waved when she walked across the stage. She appreciated that more than she told him. She moved to the group home on Fulton Avenue and stayed for 13 months. Tom ran the home on insufficient staff and genuine commitment, which was the combination that made it function. She shared a room with a girl named Bexley, who was 17 and very funny, and who was moved to a relative placement in Ashland in October. After that, Cora had the room to herself, and the quiet was both better and worse in proportions that shifted depending on the hour. On the morning of February 14th, Tom handed her the folder. Bus pass valid 2 weeks. Shelter list. A sheet titled Bridge Resources for Transitioning Youth, naming 9 programs, 3 of which had moved to new addresses and 1 of which had closed entirely. He also handed her $60 from the home's emergency fund with a specific instruction not to list it anywhere because it wasn't official. He said he hoped things went well. She thanked him. He said she should call if she needed anything, which she recognized as the necessary thing to say rather than a promise she should count on. She didn't blame him for it. He was already doing more than the job required. She walked out into a February morning that was wet and cold, with low clouds sitting on the bay and fog in the Douglas firs that lined the county road. She had the folder, the $60 plus the last of her own savings that brought her total to $28 after she'd already spent the bus fare to the harbor. The shelters were a dead end. 14-day waitlist at the first, no timeline at the second. A recorded message at the third that cycled through the same information every 2 minutes. She stood outside a laundromat and called all 3 numbers twice, in case she'd misheard something. She hadn't. She sat on a bench by the water and watched a pelican work the dock pilings in the fog. The pelican didn't appear to be having a better morning than she was, but it also didn't appear to be worrying about it, which she found faintly encouraging. She thought about what she was going to do in 14 days if the waitlist didn't move, and she thought about it the way she had learned to think about problems that had no clean solution, by finding the edge of it and sitting there long enough to see it clearly. She had been sitting there about 40 minutes when she noticed the bulletin board. It was mounted on a post near the harbor master's office, a water-stained wooden frame with a glass panel and notices behind it. Property sales. Marina fee schedules. A lost dog posted in November, still there in February. She read through it because she had time, and because reading things when you had nowhere to be at least made you feel like you were doing something with the waiting. The auction notice was at the bottom, half covered by a harbor regulation form that had slipped sideways on its pin. Coos Bay County Asset Liquidation. Delinquent vessels and marine properties. She read it slowly. There were 3 items listed. The second one stopped her. Lot 2, houseboat. Approximately 42 feet, designation the Aldous, slip 14, Aldous Marine, Coquille River Road. Vessel status, partially submerged. Assessed value, $0. Minimum bid, $5. She looked at the harbor. She looked back at the notice. She read it a third time to make sure she hadn't misread the decimal. The auction was the next morning at 9. She had $28. The auction paperwork fee was $12. That left $16, which was not much but was more than nothing. And $16 meant one specific week if she was careful, and a shorter week if she wasn't. She had been careful for most of her life. She was good at it. She found a covered doorway off the main street and slept there that night, wrapped in the sleeping bag she'd carried out of the group home. It was the first time she'd slept outside, and it was as bad as she had imagined, and she got through it by staying specific about what came next. This night, then the morning, then the auction. One thing at a time. Her mother had been good at one thing at a time. She had inherited that at least. She was at the harbor master's office at 8:45. The auction was small. A county official with a clipboard, 3 bidders, a room that smelled like old paper and coffee. 2 of the 3 bidders left before the second lot was called. The remaining one was a man in a yellow rain slicker who shook his head when the county official called, the oldest. No bids? The official said. $5, Cora said. He looked at her over his glasses. He looked at the man in the slicker. The man in the slicker shrugged. Sold, the official said. She paid at the window, waited for the paperwork to be processed, and walked out of the harbor master's office with a bill of sale in her Ziploc bag alongside the shelter list and the bridge resources sheet, and the $60 that were now $11 because she'd spent $12 on the auction fee and $5 on food across the 2 days. She had $11. She had a sunken houseboat. She had not yet seen it. She walked the gravel path at the edge of the marina toward Slip 14, the path that ran the length of the docks with the river on one side and the locked dry storage sheds on the other. The February fog was still heavy on the water. She could hear the Coquille River without seeing it clearly, a low, continuous sound, like something breathing under the surface of things. Slip 14 was at the end of the Finger Pier, the last slip before the dock ran out. The houseboat was partly submerged, listing heavily to port, with about 1.5 feet of freeboard visible on the starboard side. The upper cabin structure was intact, a low-slung wooden deckhouse with wide windows, all of them fogged thick on the inside. The cedar exterior was weathered dark, with patches of old green paint still clinging to the trim and places where the weather hadn't reached. A rope ladder hung from the dock cleat down to the deckhouse rail. She stood at the top of the dock ladder and looked at it for a long time. It was listing badly. It was partly underwater. The county had assessed it at nothing, and the man in the yellow slicker hadn't wanted it at $5. It had the complete look of something the world had decided it was finished with. But the deckhouse was standing. The hull was there. The dock cleat had her name on the bill of sale now, and she had $11 and a sleeping bag and nowhere else to be. She climbed down the ladder. The deck was uneven underfoot, tilting toward the listing side, with water standing in the low corners and a smell that was part mildew, part brine, part the particular smell of wood that has been wet for a long time without the chance to dry out fully. She moved carefully, testing each plank before she shifted her weight to it. The way she had learned over 19 years to test things before trusting them. The deckhouse door was closed but not locked. She pulled it, and it opened with the sound of swollen wood releasing its hold. A slow exhale, like the cabin itself had been holding its breath for a long time, and was only now letting go. Inside, the air was close and cold and damp, with a particular stillness of a space that hadn't been entered in a long while. The main cabin was one long room, galley at the aft end, a living area forward, everything built into the narrow width of the hull the way things are built when space is the constraint and efficiency is the only real option. The galley had a 2-burner propane stove, a stainless sink, and a fold-down counter held up by a bracket. The cupboards above were open and mostly empty except for a tin of coffee grounds so old it had dried to a solid and a stack of paper plates still in the original cellophane sleeve. On the far wall of the living area, mounted at eye level with 4 brass screws that had gone green at the edges, was a maritime compass in a round brass housing. The casing was tarnished but complete, and the compass card inside was reading steady to north despite the boat's list. It was the kind of compass you mount somewhere permanent because you plan to stay. The kind you don't pack when you leave. On the fold-down table, an unfinished ship model sat exactly mid-project, a river tugboat in 1/4-inch scale. The small wooden planks sorted by size and labeled sections, a bottle of model cement with its lid still open and dried to the threads months or years ago, a set of miniature clamps holding a partially assembled deck section together at an angle that said the glue had cured and the work had been set aside just for a moment, as if the builder had gone to the galley to refill his coffee and simply had not come back. And on the wall beside the porthole, pinned with 2 round thumbtacks, a hand-drawn map in blue and green crayon on a piece of notebook paper. The Coquille River rendered in careful crayon blue, with small X marks at notable spots along both banks, each one labeled in pencil. A dock labeled the Big Dock. A bend labeled Good for Crabs. A sandbar in the middle of the channel labeled Where We Swim. In the bottom right corner, in the careful, deliberate printing of a child of about 8 years old, 2 words and a season. Roy and me summer. Cora stood in front of the map for a long time without moving. She went back through the deckhouse. A door aft of the galley opened into a sleeping berth, 2 bunks built into the hull, the lower one with a bare mattress, and a wool blanket folded at the foot with the precise neatness of someone who did things carefully by habit. A porthole above the upper bunk was crusted with salt on the outside, but the glass was intact. The floor of the berth was dry, which told her the list was confined to the forward sections of the hull below the waterline. She picked up the wool blanket and tried it. Damp at the outer edges but not ruined. There was a head, a small marine head and a sink, that might still work, and a door behind it leading to a storage space that held a life jacket from another decade and a coil of dock line that had stiffened with age. She would sort through the rest later. She went back to the living area and sat down on the built-in bench seat across from the ship model. She looked at the compass on the wall. The card still read north. Whatever else had happened to this boat, the flooding, the list, the years of abandonment, the compass had held its heading through all of it. She'd been in motion since February 14th. She was 19 years old. She had been sleeping in a covered doorway and before that in a group home, and before that in a bedroom in someone else's house where the rules changed without notice. She had no job, no plan, no contacts within 100 miles who would pick up the phone. She was also, for the first time she could clearly remember, somewhere that had her name on it. She lifted the crayoned river map from the wall very carefully, working the thumbtacks loose with her fingernails without tearing the paper. She turned it over. On the back, in the same careful child printing as the front, were 3 words. Find the hatch. She went back to the galley. The bilge hatch she'd already found. A standard 2-foot access panel in the galley floor that opened onto the gray water lapping below. But the note said find the hatch, not find this hatch, which meant there was a different one. She sat down on the galley floor and looked at it with different attention. The flooring was marine plywood covered in a rubberized non-slip mat that had buckled and lifted in places from moisture and time. She pulled the mat back section by section, checking the joints between panels, working from aft toward forward. She found it near the aft bulkhead, almost at the base of the wall, a steel panel, roughly 16 inches square, set flush with the plywood surrounding it and welded into a steel frame that had been bolted through the floor structure into the hull framing below. This was not factory work. Someone had cut the floor of the boat for this and fitted the frame by hand sometime after the boat was built, in the careful and particular way of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and intended for it to last. The panel had no ring pull, no visible hinge on the top surface. She ran her fingers around the weld seam. A careful bead applied all the way around in sections, not a single continuous pass, and at one corner, where the bead was slightly built up, a flat steel tab protruding just far enough from the surface to get a tool under. She went through the galley drawers until she found a canvas roll of flathead screwdrivers behind the stove. She took the largest, worked the blade under the tab at the corner, braced her other hand against the floor, and pulled. The weld cracked at the seam with a sound like a rifle shot in the confined space of the galley. She sat back and let her heart settle for a moment. Then she worked the blade around the entire perimeter, section by section, cracking the seal free in stages. When she lifted the panel, it came up on a pin hinge fitted into the far edge. It had never been completely welded shut, only sealed against the water, the weld acting as a gasket rather than a permanent closure. Below the panel was a dry cavity lined with marine sealant on all four sides, the kind of careful waterproofing that took time and intention. The space was about 4 inches deep and large enough to hold a flat tin document box and a folded canvas envelope. She lifted both out and set them on the galley counter. The tin box held two things: a roll of bills held with a rubber hair tie. She counted it twice, deliberately, $430 in a mix of 20s and 5s. And a brass key with the number 47 stamped into the flat of the bow. The canvas envelope held a journal, river green canvas, water-resistant, the size of a legal notepad, the cover worn smooth at the corners from handling. She opened it. The first page had a date from 22 years ago and one line in a seaman's careful upright hand. "If I write it down, at least someone will know." She read. Roy Aldous had kept this journal for 20 years. It was not a personal diary. It didn't record his feelings or his general days or his opinions on the weather or the tides. It recorded people, names, situations, what he did, what it cost in money or time or both, and what happened after in the cases where he could find out. The running account of a life spent in quiet service to anyone who came to the river in difficulty and found Roy Aldous there. Pulled a man out of the water at the 4th Street Bridge in September. He'd been in the river long enough that warming him up took most of the night. Brought him aboard, fed him, kept him through the dark. His name was Marcus. He had no identification and gave no explanation for how he'd come to be in the water, and I didn't ask. In the morning he said could he work off what he'd eaten. I told him the river didn't keep accounts and neither did I. He left heading south. I hope he made it to wherever south meant for him. She turned the page. Santa Birch's daughter needed a doctor, and Santa doesn't say anything to anyone about anything, which meant she came to me because there was no one else to ask. I drove the girl to the clinic in Marshfield and paid the copay at the front desk and told Santa afterward to put it out of her mind. She hasn't, but she's pretending to, which is the right approach. Page after page, 20 years worth. Sometimes weeks between entries, sometimes several in a single month, the natural pattern of need, which follows no schedule and respects no convenient gaps. Gave Hensley's boy work on the dock. 16. Sleeping in his truck since his father left in the fall. He learns fast and listens and doesn't make excuses when he gets something wrong. In 3 weeks he handles the dock winch better than men twice his age, who've been at it for years. I pay him honest wages and let him use the shower aboard without asking him about it, because that's the thing he needs most, and the one thing he won't say. Quietly renewed the mortgage fees for slip 6 while Mrs. Callan was in the hospital. She thinks it was a billing error from the county. I let her think it. Billing errors happen. River came up in March 3 feet above normal in 48 hours. The Tyndall family's skiff came loose in the night and went down the cut in the dark. They couldn't afford to replace it. Found a similar skiff in the county decommission lot, paid $80 for it, left it tied at their dock in the early morning with a note that said found adrift. No markings, no claimant. By June their youngest boy was taking it out in the afternoons on his own. Cora read until the light through the portholes had shifted from the flat gray of midday to the low gold of late afternoon on the Oregon coast. She read the way you read something when you understand that what you're holding is not just a document. It was the complete record of a man who had spent 20 years watching this stretch of river and quietly catching people when they fell, and who had never mentioned any of it to anyone. She knew this because the journal was the only place he had written it down. The handwriting grew shakier in the last entries, the letters still formed carefully but with the visible effort of hands that had lost some of their steadiness. The last entry was dated 3 years ago, in early spring. Knees are finished now, can't manage the dock work anymore, and the boat needs more than I can give her. Filed the mortgage transfer instructions with the county, and let the fees go delinquent on the schedule they'll naturally follow. They'll list the boat at auction in a year or two when the numbers reach the threshold. Set the minimum bid at $5 through the assessor's office. Not free. A person ought to pay something to know the thing has value. Not more than $5. The right person shouldn't be priced out of a fighting chance. That's the line I've thought about, and $5 is it. I don't know who will find the hatch, but if they found it, they were paying attention. And if they were paying attention, they had a reason to be. What's inside is yours. The boat is yours if you want to do something with it. I hope you do. But even if you don't, at least you'll know what this place was for. If you don't want to keep it, the river will. Roy Aldous, prop, slip 14. Cora set the journal carefully on the galley counter and looked at the compass on the living area wall. North. She woke the next morning to the sound of footsteps on the dock. She came out on deck and found an older woman standing at the dock cleat with her arms crossed, studying the houseboat with the particular assessing eye of someone who had looked at a great many boats over a great many years. 70 or thereabouts, compact and straight-backed, with close-cut white hair and the weather-darkened look of a person who'd spent most of a life on the water. She was wearing a quilted vest over a flannel shirt and rubber boots that came to the knee and were the right choice for the dock in February. She looked at Cora without surprise. "You're the one who bought it," she said. "I am." The woman uncrossed her arms and extended her hand. "Pearl Dunning, slip 12. She nodded 2 slips up the dock, toward a trawler that was older but well kept, with a small wooden planter box of winter herbs on the stern deck. "I've lived aboard the Patience for 11 years. Roy Aldous was my nearest neighbor for 8 of them. Did you know him well?" "As well as Roy allowed anyone to. Which means I knew him better than most people, and still not completely." She looked at the listing hull. He'd have hated seeing her like this. "She's still floating," Cora said. "That she is." Pearl studied the deckhouse. "Mind if I come aboard?" She came aboard with the ease of a person who'd spent 60 years on boats, her balance adjusting automatically to the list without appearing to think about it. She went into the deckhouse without ceremony and stood in the middle of the living area and looked at the compass. The half-finished ship model, the crayoned river map in its place on the wall. "He left them on purpose," Pearl said. "Not by accident, and not by forgetting." "I know. The map was drawn by his granddaughter, girl named Iris. She spent every summer here from when she was 4 years old until she was 11 or 12. After that, something changed and she stopped coming." Pearl looked at the map. "Roy never told me exactly what changed, and I didn't push. But after Iris stopped coming, he took the map out of the box where he'd been keeping it and put it up on the wall where he could see it while he worked at the table." Cora waited. "Some people put things away when they hurt," Pearl said. "Roy put things up where he could see them every day. He said once that if something mattered, it ought to be in your line of sight." They sat on the aft deck with coffee from the camp stove. Bad coffee. The camp stove kind, and Pearl didn't say so. She told Cora what she knew about Roy in the way that people tell things they've been observing from a respectful distance for years, carefully, accurately, without adding what they don't know. Roy had worked the river his whole life. Started as a deckhand at 17, worked his way through every kind of river job over 20 years before he bought the houseboat in his 40s and settled at slip 14. He'd run a small salvage and towing operation from the boat for a while, then let that wind down when the knees started going. He had a son, Dean. They'd been estranged for years, the particular estrangement that begins with a specific event and then calcifies into permanent geography, the distance becoming its own reality independent of whatever started it. When Roy had his stroke 2 winters ago, mild, he'd recovered most of his function. Dean had come from Portland to arrange the care facility placement and had left again within the week, which Pearl said without editorial comment but in a tone that had some in it anyway. Roy told me he'd taken care of the boat legally before he went in, Pearl said. He said it was handled. He didn't say how. Then the county listed it at auction, and now it's yours, Pearl said. However it is that things like this happen. They sat with that for a moment. I found a journal, Cora said, behind a welded panel in the galley floor. 20 years of records. Every person he helped, every loan he made, every time he fixed something or paid for something or showed up for someone without being asked. Pearl set her mug down. He never talked about any of it? Not once. Not in 8 years. Pearl shook her head slowly. I knew some of it, pieces I couldn't help but see from the next slip over the years. People who came and went at odd hours. Situations that resolved in ways that didn't quite add up unless someone was behind them. But Roy, if you tried to ask, would suddenly remember something that needed doing at the other end of the dock. She brought the journal to Pearl that afternoon, and Pearl read it in the deck house with the camp stove running and the fog against the windows. She turned pages slowly, stopping when she recognized a name. That's Marcus, she said at one entry. He came back 3 years after Roy pulled him out of the water. Knocked on the hull at 7 in the morning and Roy made him breakfast. I saw them on the aft deck in the morning fog, and I never knew who he was until this moment. She closed the journal at the last entry and sat with it on her knees for a long moment. He would have appreciated this, Pearl said quietly. Not because it is tidy. He would have been suspicious of anything too tidy, but because things circle in ways you can't predict or plan for, and every now and then you get to be in the room when you can see it. The derelict notice arrived on the 5th day, tucked under the dock cleat in a yellow county envelope. Coos Bay Harbor Authority. The houseboat at Slip 14 had been identified as a derelict and abandoned vessel under Oregon Maritime Code. The new owner of record had 30 days to either bring the vessel to the habitability standard and certify it with the harbor marine inspector, or arrange for removal of the vessel at the owner's cost. Estimated cost of removal, $3,000 to $8,000, depending on condition of underwater hull. Cora had $13. She sat on the aft deck with the notice and looked at the river and thought about the arithmetic. Then she went to Slip 12 and knocked on the hull of the Patience. Pearl came up and read the notice without changing her expression. She set it on the stern rail. I know a few people, Pearl said. Let me make some calls. The calls Pearl made worked through the same quiet current that Roy's generosity had run on for 20 years. A network of people who felt they owed something they hadn't found a way to repay. Carl Vesper arrived first. He ran the marine repair shop at the south end of the marina, a small operation he'd had for 30 years. And he came aboard with a flashlight and spent 40 minutes in the bilge before he came back up and set his bag on the dock and wiped his hands. It's manageable, he said. The flooding is slow, a failed through hull fitting, not a breach. He looked at the boat with the evaluating calm of someone who'd done this a long time. Repack the fitting. Rebuild the bilge pump motor, and she'll float level inside a week. Cora asked what it would cost. Carl looked at her. He looked at Pearl standing on the dock with her arms crossed. He looked back at the boat. Roy pulled my own boat out of the South Channel 6 years ago when I went in during a February storm, he said. He had a line on me before I could think to ask for one, and afterward he wouldn't let me give him anything for it. He paused. I'll do it for parts. He came back the next morning with a replacement through hull fitting and a rebuilt pump motor, and by noon the bilge pump was running. It ran through the afternoon and through the night. And by the following morning the boat had come up 3 inches, and the list was measurably less. She was coming up. Others followed through the week. A woman named Della Fossey from the Maritime Heritage Museum upriver arrived with 2 volunteers and a box of exterior caulk and set to work on the deckhouse seams without being asked where to start. A retired harbor marine inspector named Doug appeared with his own tools and the quietly stated intention of walking Cora through the entire habitability checklist item by item, which was technically not his responsibility and technically his day off. 3 marina residents brought materials without coordinating with each other: lumber for a soft plank on the forward deck, a propane regulator, a coil of marine electrical wire. Pearl moved among them with the efficiency of a woman who had been organizing things for 7 decades and had learned that the less it appeared she was organizing, the more got done. Cora worked alongside everyone. She learned to caulk a seam from Della, who showed her twice and then watched once and said, "Now you know it." She learned to read the marina's wiring diagram from the copy Pearl had kept in a folder. by doing the first circuit wrong and then correcting it, which she understood was the only way to actually learn it. She sanded the deckhouse exterior in long, even strokes until her shoulders burned, then kept sanding, because the surface required it, and because working was better than thinking about how much remained. One evening she sat at the galley table after everyone had gone and finished the ship model Roy had set down mid-project. The clamps had done their job. The partially assembled deck section was solid and dry. She pressed the last plank into place, checked the alignment against the plans Roy had sketched in the inside front cover of the notebook she found in the forward cabinet, and left the model exactly where he'd left it. She didn't try to explain to herself why this felt important. It just did. By the third week, the boat was floating level. The deckhouse was recaulked and painted, the same dark green trim Roy had always used, which Pearl identified from a half-empty paint can in the marina utility shed that had been sitting there since before the boat went under. Doug walked the full checklist on a Saturday morning and found 2 remaining items: a smoke alarm needing a battery and a porthole seal that had failed. Both were addressed by afternoon. On a Thursday in early March, Doug filed the habitability certification with the Harbor Authority. The derelict notice was withdrawn. Cora stood on the bow of the Aldous in the thin March afternoon light and looked at the river. The boat was floating level, smelling of fresh caulk and paint and coffee from the maker Pearl had left on the counter 10 days ago and not reclaimed. The morning fog was lighter than it had been. The firs on the far bank showed their green against a sky that was trying to clear. Stay with me, because what Cora found sealed behind the second panel in the hull the following week is the reason Roy kept that journal and wrote it in the way he wrote it, and left it where he left it. Hit subscribe if this story is finding you. We're only halfway through, and the part that changes everything is still ahead. The letter arrived in April on a morning when the river was running high with snowmelt from the Coast Range and the cottonwood leaves on the far bank were just beginning to open, pale green and almost transparent in the early light, the kind of new that doesn't last long. It was from a Portland law firm, 1 page, dense, the language that takes 2 careful readings to decode. Dean Aldous, Roy's son, was filing a petition in Coos Bay County Probate Court to have the transfer of Slip 14 and the vessel the Aldous declared void. The legal argument was that Roy had been incompetent at the time the property was transferred or allowed to lapse into delinquency due to the residual effects of his stroke. An incompetent person could not make a valid legal transfer. If the transfer was void, the property reverted to the estate, which as Roy's only heir, Dean would inherit. The letter asked Cora to voluntarily surrender the bill of sale and vacate the vessel within 30 days. It listed a Portland address for responses. Cora set the letter on the galley table. She thought about Roy filing the mortgage transfer instructions with the county. She thought about the journal and the 20 years it covered, and the last entry and the $5 price arrived at by deliberation. She thought about the welded panel and the key behind the cup and the note in child printing on the back of the crayoned map. She thought about what Pearl had said. He planned everything. She folded the letter and put it in the waterproof envelope with the journal, and then she went to slip 12. Pearl read it standing on her stern deck. She handed it back. "He's wrong," she said. Roy Aldous had his stroke in November and was writing a clear hand in the marina registration renewal in December of the same year. "I have the copy. I keep copies of everything that touches this dock because that is the kind of person I am." The mortgage transfer was filed before he went to the care facility. His thinking in those last months was as clear as I had known it to be in 8 years of being his neighbor. She looked at Cora steadily. "This is a pressure tactic. Dean is betting that you don't have the resources to fight it and that you'll fold before the hearing date." Cora looked at the envelope in her hand. "Does Dean know about the journal? What's actually in the hull?" Pearl was careful. "He knows there was property aboard. He doesn't know what Roy left, or how deliberately Roy left it." They were both quiet for a moment. Pearl said, "I know someone who can help." Dean came on the following Saturday, arriving in a gray sedan and walking the dock in clean shoes that announced immediately that he didn't know what he was doing on a boat dock. He was 50, dark-haired, with Roy's physical build and none of Roy's stillness. He moved with the forward lean of someone already impatient before the conversation began. He stopped at the rope ladder and looked at the deckhouse for a moment before he said anything. "You've done work on it," he said, not looking at Cora. It needed work. He came aboard and walked the deckhouse slowly, looking at the fresh paint, the recaulked seams, the replaced porthole seal, the ship model on the table and the crayoned map on the wall. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't read precisely, the proportion of grief and calculation mixed in a way she didn't yet know how to separate. "My father built most of this himself," he said. "I know." He looked at her directly. "Did he leave anything aboard?" "Papers, documents. He mentioned once that there were papers." She thought about the River Green Journal. The $430. The key stamped 47. The second panel she had found but not yet opened. "He left things that belonged to the boat," she said. Dean's expression shifted slightly. "Whatever is on this boat belongs to the estate, and the estate belongs to me." "He was your father," Cora said. "He wasn't mine. He put this boat in the county auction at $5 and left it for whoever had a reason to buy it. I had a reason. I bought it. And whatever he left here, he left for a reason too." Dean stared at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he expected to be empty and found it occupied. "I'll see you in court," he said. He climbed back up the dock ladder and left without looking back. Cora watched the gray sedan pull out of the parking lot and disappear onto the county road. Then she went to find Pearl, and Pearl called Judith Ware. Judith arrived the next morning in a tan rain jacket, carrying a canvas tote bag with a legal notepad and a thermos of her own coffee. She was 60, sharp-eyed, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had made up her mind on the drive over and wasn't interested in making it again. She had practiced property and estate law in Coos Bay for 25 years before retiring 3 years ago, and she had handled the marina's legal matters for a decade of that. And Roy had helped her once with something Pearl didn't name but alluded to, and Judith still sent a card to the marina on Roy's birthday every year. She read Dean's petition at the galley table without sitting down. When she finished, she set it on the table and uncapped a pen. "The capacity argument is weak," she said. "Roy Oldys was cognitively intact until his death. I can document this personally. I notarized 2 transactions for him after his stroke, both legally sound. Both signed in his full hand, both involving decisions that required careful thought. His doctor's records from the care facility will confirm the same." She tapped the bill of sale. The transfer mechanism Roy chose was a county tax auction. A competent person choosing an unconventional transfer mechanism is not evidence of incapacity. It is evidence of deliberate and specific planning. "Can Dean win?" Cora asked. Judith considered the question in the particular way of someone who had seen a great many cases. "He can make this expensive and slow," she said. "That may be the actual strategy." She looked at Cora. "How old are you?" 19. She nodded slowly. "And you have valid title from a properly conducted county auction?" "Yes, then we respond." She put the petition in her tote bag and stood. "I'll need Roy's county records, any marina documentation of his activities, and anyone who can speak to his state of mind in the months before the transfer." "Pearl," Cora said. Judith almost smiled. "Yes, Pearl's testimony will be excellent." She left with copies of everything. 3 days after Judith's visit, Cora found the second compartment. She'd noticed the stone before, a flat piece in the sleeping berth's aft bulkhead, slightly lighter in color than the fiberglass lining around it, set with a careful bead of caulk that was newer than anything else in the berth. She'd taken it for a repair patch and moved on. This time she looked at it differently. The caulk was not structural. She ran her penknife around the edge and the stone came free, pivoting inward on a small brass pin. Behind it was a cavity in the hull liner, sealed at all 4 edges with marine sealant, the same method as the floor panel and applied with the same care. Inside, a waterproof envelope and, beneath it, a second journal. Smaller than the first, a pocket-sized notebook, river green canvas, thick with years of accumulated pages. She opened it in the sleeping berth, sitting cross-legged on the lower bunk with the porthole light coming through. The handwriting was Roy's, but the entries were different from the main journal. Longer, more personal, written in the manner of someone not sure who they were writing for, only that they needed to write it. Less ledger, more letter. The private record behind the official one. 40 pages in, a name stopped her breath. October, 19 years ago. A woman came to the marina in the evening, just before dark. She came down the dock the way people come down docks when they need something but can't quite say it yet. Sideways. Slow. Watching the exits more than the destination. Young, late 20s, maybe. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder and the particular careful exhaustion of someone who hadn't properly slept in several days and was managing on will. She asked if she could sit on the dock for a while. I said of course. The dock doesn't belong to me that way. We talked eventually, in the gradual way that conversations start on docks in the evening when the light is going and there's nowhere either of you needs to be. Her name was Sandra. She was pregnant, not very far along, maybe 4 months, maybe 5, hard to tell. She'd come up from California, she said, following a situation that hadn't worked out. She was trying to get north to Coos Bay where she had a cousin. But she'd missed the last northbound bus and didn't have enough for the next one and didn't want to call the cousin to ask because she was tired of asking, tired of the weight of asking. I said, was she hungry? She said she wasn't. I made soup and set a bowl in front of her and left it there without asking again. She ate 2 bowls and said thank you more times than the occasion required, which told me something about how rarely she'd had occasion to say it lately. She stayed the night in the forward berth. In the morning I gave her the bus fare north and $40 besides. And when she tried to refuse, I told her what I've told everyone who tries to refuse. It isn't a loan, and it isn't charity, and it doesn't require repayment or even remembering. It's just what happens here. Her last name was Vane. Sandra Vane. I've thought about her since, the way you think about people who pass through briefly and leave a shape in the air after they've gone. She had the look of someone carrying something very heavy by will alone, stubborn in the specific way that people become stubborn when they've had to be for long enough that it has become second nature. Competent and careful and not at all sure things were going to work out but going anyway, which is its own kind of bravery. I hope the cousin was reliable. I hope the north was what she needed. I hope the baby came out healthy and stayed that way. If her children ever find their way to this river, and I have a feeling about the way things circle, even things that seem to go in only one direction, they should know that their mother sat on the aft deck of this boat on a cold October evening and ate soup and said thank you more times than she needed to. And that she had good eyes and stubborn hands and she did not give up on things that mattered to her. That's worth knowing about a person. It's the kind of thing a person should know about where they came from. Cora set the notebook down on the lower bunk. She sat very still and listened to the river moving against the hull and the sound of the marina around her and the distant call of a heron somewhere on the far bank. The afternoon light had gone from the porthole, and the berth was in shadow now. Her mother's name had been Sandra Vane. Her mother had come to Coos Bay at 27, pregnant and alone without enough for the bus fare north. She had sat on the aft deck of this boat. She had eaten soup at the table in the deckhouse above her right now. She had slept in this berth, this exact berth, on the mattress that had been replaced since, but in the space that hadn't changed. She had left north toward her cousin in Coos Bay. And 6 months later, in April, Cora had been born. Sandra Vane had raised her daughter alone through 7 years and 8 apartments and endless double shifts, and she had died when Cora was 11 on a Tuesday in October, and she had never once told Cora that she'd spent a night on a houseboat on the Coquille River and eaten soup made by a man named Roy Aldous, who asked her nothing and gave her $40, and told her it didn't need to be. Remembered. Roy Aldous had never known Sandra Vane's daughter existed. He'd known Sandra for a single evening and a morning. But he had written her name in a private notebook and thought about her over the years and hoped the baby came out healthy. And then he had filed a $5 price instruction with the county assessor and sealed a river green journal behind a welded steel panel in the floor of a boat he'd priced, not for free but low, not for nothing but barely something, not more than a fighting chance costs. He hadn't known who was coming. But he had prepared the right place for whoever was. She went to find Pearl. Pearl read the entry standing in the deckhouse, holding the small notebook in both hands, reading it slowly in the last light coming through the polished porthole. She read it twice. When she finished, she set it beside the completed ship model on the table and looked at the compass on the wall for a long moment without speaking. Then, he would have loved this, she said quietly. Not because it's tidy. He would have been skeptical of anything too tidy, but because it went further than he could have planned. Because things circle in ways you can't predict or arrange for, and every now and then the circle closes where you can see it. Cora looked at the compass. North, he never met me, she said. No. Pearl folded her hands on the table, but your mother sat in this deckhouse. She ate at this table. She slept in that berth. She left north and had you. And 19 years later, you walked down this dock with $28 and raised your hand when nobody else would. She looked at Cora with the steady, unhurried care of someone who understood the full weight of what she was saying. He didn't know who was coming, Pearl said. But he prepared exactly the right place. The probate hearing was on a Tuesday morning in late April in the county courthouse hearing room on the second floor, which smelled like floor wax, and the particular institutional patience of a room where people have been sorting out difficult things for a long time. Cora had expected Pearl, Judith, and perhaps 2 or 3 people from the marina who'd expressed support. She had not expected 16. Pearl in the second row in her navy blazer. Carl Vesper in his work clothes because he'd come directly from the shop at 7 in the morning. Della Fosse from the Maritime Museum with a volunteer who'd helped recaulk the deckhouse. Doug, the retired inspector, sitting straight in a folding chair as if it were a witness stand. The woman Cora had identified from the journal as Santa, the woman who cleaned the marina heads and, in Roy's own words, didn't say anything to anyone about anything. She was saying something today. She was here. 3 other people Cora didn't know, who had learned about the hearing through the marina's word of mouth and had decided that showing up was the thing to do. Dean sat at the petitioner's table with his Portland attorney. He didn't look at the gallery. Judge Ramona Okafor had read the petition before she walked in. Cora could tell by the manner in which she moved through the preliminary material without pausing. Judith presented the defense with the methodical precision of someone who had organized her argument into an order from which she would not deviate. She laid out the timeline. Roy's stroke in November, his continued legal activity in the months following, documented by the marina's own records. The mortgage transfer instructions he had filed with the county, obtained through a records request. Filed 11 months before his death, and 5 months before the stroke. The care facility intake assessment, which rated his cognitive function as normal for his age on the date of admission. She then placed her own notarized records on the judge's table, 2 transactions completed with Roy after his stroke, both coherent and detailed, both signed in his full hand. Both requiring careful deliberation to execute. She called Pearl to testify. Pearl spoke for 8 minutes in the plain, specific manner of someone who had thought carefully about what she was going to say and said only that, and nothing more. She described Roy's state of mind in the months before his death as clear, deliberate, and entirely consistent with the man she had known for 8 years. She described his habit of planning things carefully over long timelines without announcing his intentions to anyone. She described the $5 price instruction as something Roy would have thought about at length and settled on for specific reasons. Because Roy thought about everything at length and settled on specific reasons. Judith submitted the county mortgage transfer form that predated the stroke by 5 months, which was the document that made the entire capacity argument collapse at its base. A decision made 5 months before the event could not be a consequence of the event. She then placed the last entry of the first journal on the judge's table. "What's inside is yours." Judge Okafor read it. She read it again. She looked at the petitioner's table. "Your father," she said, "appears to have expressed his intentions quite clearly, in his own handwriting, in a document he prepared and placed deliberately within the property he was transferring. He did this at a time when, by the documentary record before me, he was unambiguously competent to do so. The incapacity argument fails on the timeline and on the evidence of intent." Dean's attorney made a revised argument about the personal property aboard the vessel. Judge Okafor looked at him for a moment. "The vessel was auctioned with its contents as found," Judith said. "Furthermore, those contents appear to have been intentionally placed aboard as part of a deliberate bequest to whoever acquired the property through the auction mechanism Roy himself specified. That intent is documented in Roy Oldis's own hand." Judge Okafor read the journal entry one more time. She closed the folder. "Petition denied," she said. "The bill of sale stands. Ms. Vane retains full title to the vessel and its contents. I note for the record that this property appears to have been deliberately transferred by a man who planned carefully, to a person who arrived with adequate reason. That is the end of this matter." She brought the gavel down. In the hallway, Carl Vesper shook Cora's hand firmly. Della Fosse said Roy would have been satisfied, which from someone who had known Roy was the highest available commendation. Doug nodded once and went to his truck. Santa, who didn't say anything to anyone about anything, put both arms around Cora and held on for a moment without speaking, which said everything that needed saying. Dean was the last one out. He stood at the top of the courthouse steps for a long moment looking at something Cora couldn't see. Then he looked at her, not with the recalculating expression she'd seen at the marina, but with something older and quieter. The expression of a man understanding, perhaps for the first time clearly, what his father had built over 40 years, and where he had aimed it, and why it had gone there instead of here. He didn't say anything. He walked to the gray sedan and left. Pearl walked with Cora down the courthouse steps into the April air, which smelled like cottonwood and moving water. "Now you can do the real work," Pearl said. She cashed the savings bonds through Judith, who helped navigate the process without billing for the assistance. The total came to just under $2,000, accumulated over 15 years of Roy buying bonds in small denominations when the boat had anything to spare, sealing them in the hull cavity like something planted in ground he intended to keep. She paid Carl for the parts. Carl refused. She said it was not negotiable, that Roy's last instructions had been explicit about the purpose of what was in the hull, and that Carl's materials qualified. Carl took the check with the expression of a man who had lost an argument to someone who wasn't in the room. She paid the delinquent marina fees. She paid Judith's documented out-of-pocket costs. She put 2 months of mortgage fees in reserve and felt the particular satisfaction of paying in advance for something she intended to keep for a long time. She thought about what the boat was for. Roy had used the forward berth for people who needed a place to stop. Sandra Vane had been one of them. The boy who'd been sleeping in his truck had been another. Marcus from the water. The fishing crew member in the log who'd arrived between runs and stayed 2 days. Roy hadn't advertised any of it. He'd kept the berth available and answered the door when people knocked and made soup without asking anyone to explain themselves. Cora went to the Marina Community Board near the harbor master's office and pinned a card in the center of it. On clean white cardstock Pearl had contributed from her desk. Forward berth available, short term, no charge. River access. Ask at slip 14. Pearl raised an eyebrow when she heard. Roy did something very similar. Informally, Cora showed her the journal entry. The forward berth was unoccupied. Pearl read it and held the journal a moment longer than she needed to. Then she handed it back and said, "That's about right." The first person to use the berth was a young woman from the marina maintenance crew who'd been sleeping in her car while her apartment situation resolved itself over 14 days. She left a box of oranges from the coastal farmers market when she went, which was the exactly right proportion of gratitude. The second was a man between commercial fishing runs, quiet and self-contained, who replaced the soap he used from his own supply and left the berth cleaner than he'd found it, which told Cora something clear about him. She kept a log in a river green notebook, a record, not a diary. Names, dates, brief notes on what had been needed and what had been offered. She wrote it at the galley table in the evenings by the light of the lamp she'd repaired herself after watching the right video twice and doing it correctly. She got a part-time job at the marina fuel dock, which paid enough to cover her ongoing costs and leave a narrow margin. She learned the boats and their captains, who needed what and when. Carl taught her things she hadn't asked to learn, in the way that competent people teach when they find someone who pays close attention. How to splice a line properly. How to read a coastal marine forecast. How to diagnose a diesel engine by the sound it made at idle. She did things correctly because she had learned early that doing things correctly the first time was faster than doing them twice. Pearl came by most mornings with coffee she considered superior to Cora's, and they sat on the aft deck and watched the river and said the things that needed saying and left the rest alone. Which was the right balance. August arrived on the coast with the particular soft light that follows the fog, and on an early morning when the marina was white and still, Cora was on the stern deck with her mug when she heard footsteps on the dock. Careful footsteps, the particular tread of someone who wasn't sure they had permission to be here. She looked up. A girl of 17 or 18 was coming slowly toward slip 14, reading the laminated card Pearl had made and fastened to the dock cleat in June. She had a backpack over one shoulder and a small rolling suitcase, and the very particular stillness of someone who had been carrying something alone for too long and had gotten very good at not letting it show. Cora set down her mug. She stepped to the rail. "Looking for the forward berth?" she said. The girl looked up. Her eyes were careful and direct. "I don't have any money right now," she said. "That's not what it's for," Cora said. Her name was Marin. She'd aged out of the foster system in Medford 6 weeks earlier and had been moving between options since then. She was 17, and she stood on the dock with her suitcase in the morning fog, with the composed quality of someone who had learned to hold a great deal still beneath a very steady surface. Cora recognized it precisely. She'd been wearing the same composure for 19 years. "Come aboard," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." By October the river had dropped to its autumn level, and the cottonwoods on the far bank had gone yellow all at once. The bright particular yellow of the coast range in fall that holds for about 10 days before the wind takes it. The mornings were cold and clear, the kind of cold that came off the water before the sun reached the marina. The Aldous was floating level and well maintained, freshly painted before the summer ended, mooring lines sound and checked. Pearl had organized a dock gathering in September for everyone who'd helped with a refloat, and the gathering had involved a great deal of food and no speeches, which Pearl said was how Roy would have wanted it. Cora stood on the bow in the early morning light and drank her coffee and watched the river. Inside the deckhouse, the compass was polished and reading north. The ship model sat completed on the table. The crayoned river map was on the wall above the porthole, the same 2 thumbtacks. The X marks faded a little more now, but still legible. The big dock, good for crabs, where we swim. 3 things from a man she had never met. And beside the map one more, the photograph Pearl had found in her own box from 8 years ago. Roy on the aft deck in a summer, one hand raised, squinting into the sun the way you do when someone surprises you with a camera. He looked exactly like the man in the journal. Unhurried, specific, looking slightly past the lens, toward the water and whatever was on it. Marin was below, making coffee and defending her position on the press pot. She'd been aboard 2 months and had developed specific opinions about the coffee ratio, the correct way to coil a dock line, the optimal storage arrangement for the forward cabinet, all of which she held with a quiet precision that reminded Cora of Roy's handwriting in the journal, small, certain, made to last. She'd started helping at the fuel dock on weekend mornings at Carl's suggestion, and the dock manager had agreed on the basis that she learned quickly and didn't create problems, and Pearl had arranged this the way Pearl arranged most things, without appearing to arrange anything at all. Pearl knocked on the hull at 7:30, as she did most mornings now. Cora poured 3 cups and they sat in the deckhouse while the fog burned off the river and the light came in through the polished portholes, warming the compass and the ship model and the crayoned map and the photograph, all of the things Roy had left in their places, and the new thing Cora had added beside them. Roy Aldous had not built something grand. He had built a practice. Show up, keep the berth available, make the soup, ask nothing, let the river bring whoever the river was going to bring. He had done it for 20 years and written it in a river green journal and sealed it behind welded steel in the floor of a boat he'd priced at $5, not free. Because nothing is free in the sense that matters, not more than 5. Because the right person shouldn't be priced out of a fighting chance. What you leave behind is not always the thing you built. Sometimes it is only the doors you left open, and who walked through them, and who those people left open for the next one.